Hi, welcome to the CCA and to the Rutgers Book Initiative. I'm Leah Price. I'm director of the Book Initiative, which is on the verge of opening a humanities makerspace called the Scarlet Letterpress. But until that is open, I just want to show those of you on the Zoom a non-virtual, non-wallpaper marbles at a workshop organized by Professor Sean Silver on Monday, and to encourage anyone who is local to come talk to me if you'd like to use the letterpress in the spring semester. One pre-letterpress product printed by students at the Book Initiative is a series of cards that substitute for the Zoom hand raise feature. So if you want to take one and pass it along, if you're physically in the room and you have a question, you can just wave around the card instead of waving around your hand. And an option. Right, be careful not to twitch accidentally. So tonight's panel focuses on Denise Gigante's just out Book Madness, a story of book collectors in America. And we're going to start with a brief set of reflections about the book from Professor Gigante before moving on to responses by Dr. Jesse Erickson from the Morgan Library, Dr. Heather O'Donnell from Honey and Wax Books, and Dr. Melina Moe from Columbia University Library, and we'll then turn back to Professor Gigante for response to those responses, and we'll then open up for general discussion.
So the book began as a experiment in something that I've called associational literary history. I wanted to see what it would be like to trace the lives of 60s, well, not the full 60, but a number of association copies from Charles Lamb's library. Charles Lamb was, the British essayist, was immensely influential in America in the mid-19th century, largely because he opened up a whole range of bibliographical writing that was literary in nature and was also allowed a subjective element into the discussion of books. So bibliography in the 18th century, as the listing and description of books, became increasingly quirky and interesting in Thomas Frognall Dibdin, who's Lamb's contemporary, in his bibliographical works, yet they remained mainly bibliographical works, whereas Lamb's essays such as Detached Thoughts on Books and Reading, The Two Races of Men, Hazlitt's on Reading Old Books, Hunt's thousands of essays on books, Men and Books, Bookbinding and Heliodorus, etc., opened up what has become really kind of bibliographical book journalism. It's a little bit like gastronomical writing, in which you take an object from a material object and use it as an occasion for reflections on taste and other things, and particularly the individual experience of interacting with a particular copy of the book. So the library that was Lamb's was known to an American audience because Lamb had written about it so lovingly and so well. And Lamb was really the patron saint of book collectors in the 19th century. He was somebody who, if you survey a range of book auction catalogs from the 19th century, which I've done, it doesn't matter what is in the collection. It can be the most expensive incunabula, illuminated manuscripts, special collector's editions from the Shakespeare Press. Doesn't matter what's in the library or how big it is. You have some of these library auction catalogs that are very thick with thousands of, if any of Lamb's old books are in there, it's on the cover. Every single time. The associational quality of these books was something that was developing as a mode of sentimental collecting. Value of the books were based on associational value, and in particular, associational value with a known literary figure. And so this was something Americans pioneered. It didn't start in Britain. Amy Lowell with Keats, and in Lamb's case, everybody, everybody congregated around the sale of these 60 association copies in New York in 1848. And then the second event that year was when 18 of those, which one bibliomaniac had purchased, were resold at auction. And that became another central event in the transatlantic book world that really did cause a sensation as a very exciting moment in sentimental collecting. By the early 20th century, sentimental collecting had come into its own, and you have something like Harry B. Smith's A Sentimental Library in 1914, which basically is a collection of, a long descriptive catalog of association copies, collections of association copies. And Smith followed on the heels of Charles Frederickson, who was another American pioneer in the field of the British Romantic poets. So I obviously have a lot more to say, but I'd like to turn it over to the panel, and I'm very grateful to everyone for having spent time with the book. I'm very grateful to everyone who's here to engage in this conversation, and also everybody online. And thank you, Leah, for arranging it.
Well, it's truly an honor to be on this panel, such an esteemed panel. And I'm very, very grateful for the invitation, Leah, so thank you. The book's fantastic. I'm gonna launch right in to my remarks. I do have a title for my piece. I call it The Nose. Anthropomorphic signifiers of bibliophilic collecting habits. So 20 years have passed since Henry Petrosky's remark in the book On the Bookshelf, quote, "Some owners of books, especially of those investment properties known as rare books, apparently believe that volumes on a shelf are like paintings on a museum wall. They're to be seen, but not touched," end quote. In support of this observation, Petrosky noted, quote, "The sentiment is not new, for 19th century English essayist Charles Lamb called book borrowers mutilators of collections, spoilers of the symmetry themselves, and creators of odd volumes," end quote. Evidently, Petrosky's reference to Lamb was made in an attempt to provide historical evidence for the notion that rare book collectors acquire books as fetish objects, not to be amassed for research value, but as status symbols appreciated for their aesthetic quality, their financial worth, or what they represent as cultural objects. Yet, the reference, being inadvertently contradictory to the premise, reveals a cultural phenomenon that lies deep at the heart of the book collecting world, mysterious, elusive, and deserving of further exploration. It is the underlying force that animates much of the book buying activity in Denise Gigante's Book Madness, referred to charmingly as, quote unquote, a nose. Very early in the book, in discussing Henry Stevens Jr.'s approach to book hunting, Stevens is described as having, quote, inherited his father's nose. Gigante writes, quote, "Whereas technique in book collecting can be acquired, a nose for a book made rare by age, association, or some other feature is difficult, if not impossible to cultivate," end quote. A nose, Gigante reminds us, quote, "is the sign of an exacting taste in books as in wine," end quote. Here, Gigante introduces us to the notion of the nose, a cultural phenomenon somewhat unique to the rare book world that I hope to begin to disentangle from its strategic ambiguity. The nose is intentionally vague as a concept because its vagueness ensures its mimetic reproductivity, spreading from each new culture and each new generation that either implicitly or explicitly embraces it. On the surface, what strikes us most immediately is the metaphorical anthropomorphizing involved with the attributing a single human sense to a complex set of networks that involve global markets, scholarly discourses, and institutions devoted to the preservation and curation of historical, textual, and visual culture. The practice, common in the tradition of Western connoisseurship, has a number of variably interchangeable parallels, typically appropriate to their respective spheres. We say someone has an eye for design, or an ear for music, or great taste in one thing or another. The attribution makes sense as an abstraction, deceptive in its simplicity. Only when the abstraction is scrutinized does the mirage of simplicity collapse. It is only when we question what characteristics define the ability to discern good from bad, good from great, iconic from timeless, do the answers vary far beyond what the metaphor can sufficiently encapsulate. Still, the nose is a fascinating protuberance to employ, and the sniff, a fascinating action of the sense to apply as the descriptor. Smell, being less manifestly visually oriented than sight, less manifestly connected to the experience of flavor than taste, but interdependent in both, is easy to take for granted. The aromatic experience has no need to seek nourishment for its own sake, but needs to be nourished nonetheless. Always present, it often comes to our attention in the following four circumstances: when it is pleasantly evoking seduction, when it is piercing revulsion, when it stimulates our nostalgia, or when it is damaged or disruptive. In terms of the latter, having lost this sense, many of the first people to come down with COVID-19 realized just how much they had previously disregarded it. Relatedly, the physical characteristics of the nose have been weaponized as a signifier of either beauty and intelligence or stupidity and ugliness. A late 19th century manual on phrenology, the now infamous pseudoscience, describes the quote, Malay race as having quote, nose short and concave, while the aquiline nose is attributed to the indigenous American. Perhaps rooted in similar discursive racializing phenomena, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and anti-Black stereotypes commonly single out the nose as an undesirable marker of racial difference. What then constitutes which defines having a nose for something? The ability to sniff something out and separate the object of unique or special value not readily apparent to the casual passerby. How does it apply to the bibliophile and to the collector of books? The first quality of having a nose is arguably the easiest to identify and to caricature, much in the way that Petrosky caricatured the antiquarian book collector in my opening. It is the nose of snobbery, of quote unquote looking down on others due to one's wealth, privilege, pedigree, and access to the resources one needs to participate and influence the market by transforming individual proclivity into asset capital. The phrase is, quote, look down one's nose at something or someone, which is why the snob is almost always caricatured with a prominent nose turned high. It is important to return here to Gigante's cast of characters, who are described much less interchangeably as book connoisseurs, bibliomaniacs, and antiquarians, among other designations. She writes of the bellatrix searching out books for their historical and cultural importance over their rarity. The story of Charles Lamb's library and the rise of sentimental collecting offers a compelling picture of just how different these genres of book people can be from each other. At times diametrically opposed, but existing always in a form of bibliographical symbiosis, feeding the networks that keep collection materials in accessible circulation in one form or another. Writing on quote unquote enigma of Warhol and Poplar, Jean Baudrillard articulated the quintessence of the book connoisseur's collecting spirit, in my opinion, when he mused that what is sought is a quote, superficial, artificial object which succeeds in preserving its artificiality and shaking free of any natural signification to take on special intensity, empty of meaning, which is that of the fetish, end quote. Now, this breed of collector would undoubtedly push back on such a radical characterization for their collecting practice. And indeed, there were many in the past who maintained that their altruistic intentionality superseded their desire to amass a great library as a status symbol. Nevertheless, the acquisition of bibliographical treasures as status symbols, by definition, transforms the book object into a fetish, best epitomized by having the finest books, unread, never let, unblemished, yet rebound in uniform, decorative elite bindings as a statement of wealth and power. Now, at the other end of the spectrum were people like Charles Lamb, collectors who created value through association and kept books that were distressed and affectionately vandalized by imitation, read repeatedly in a form of capital engendered by affect and sentimentality. For collectors of this nature, collecting from the heart is more important than having a nose for what is best or what is in vogue among one's peers, and books can be lent out and Grangerized and inscribed and dog-eared to the heart's desire. Now, between these extremes are antiquarians, bibliographers, and bibliomaniacs, those who are either obsessed with the historical integrity of the book object, the historical integrity of the textuality, or the integrity of the relationship between them. With the quote, exacting eye of a bibliomaniac, Gigante writes of antiquarian George Livermore, reflecting upon the library of his 20s, he, quote, only sees gaps and deficiencies, bound to later acquire only the best editions of the best authors. But which are the best editions? Who are the best authors? And does having a nose for collecting help to sort out the wheat from the chaff? In the overwhelmingly textual camp of bibliomania, librarian, bibliographer, and scholar Joseph Green Cogswell, quote, resisted such collecting fetishes as limited, tall, or large paper copies, end quote, on the one hand, but on the other hand, the quote, sentimental appeal of first editions and association copies held no sway over him. For these collectors, the goal of knowledge production, which they frame as the advancement of civilization through the preservation of history, was paramount in their rationale for collection building. Maybe then, in these cases, having an exacting eye that could pierce through the possible forgeries or misleading imprints or other historical curiosities would be better than having a nose for more desirable sought-after fetishistic copies that could bring in greater prices at auction. During the early 19th century, having a nose for association would have been comparatively difficult at the time when sentimental collectors were relatively few and far between. By that measure, Charles Lamb, who oscillates and focuses throughout the larger narrative of 19th century American bibliophilism in Gigante's book, was somewhat of a visionary in his ability to create value through association. However, even as we're able to demarcate divisions among major collecting habits and trends that separate the aristocratic legacy builder from the antiquarian conservationist, from the impassioned yet struggling sentimental bibliophile, the reality of the world's great collections often reveals blended, heterogeneous combinations of these habits on their shelves. At the Morgan Library, where I work, for instance, which owes its reputation both to having literary high spots in the finest condition and for having many of the world's book historical treasures, has a handful of books from Lamb's library, including Bernard Barton's devotional verses, William Godwin's Antonio, Philip Sidney's Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, and James White's original letters of Sir John Falstaff. The Sidney, unsurprisingly, was an early acquisition. White and Godwin came later, one of which was noted as a mid-20th century acquisition, building upon the reputation and momentum for collection development established by J.P. Morgan, his son Jack, and Belle de Costa Green. The only volume out of these examples to come to Morgan as a relatively late edition was Barton's devotional verses, which came to the library in the Gordon Ray collection, along with its printed ticket for the Moxon sale. The Gordon Ray collection, likewise, is further demonstrative of the long and gradual ascendancy of the sentimental collection, as within it is found a considerable gathering of extra illustrated books. And I add here that Carter Burden is sort of the culmination of that Carter Burden collection of modern first edition, most of which turn out to be association copies. So by that time, mid-20th century, very much in vogue. Charles Lamb's instincts then for building his library with affection over means was for the most part predictive of future trends, or at least a revival of something that perhaps existed much earlier that may have fallen out of favor by that period, I'm not sure. And who knows at the end of the 20th century could have sniffed out the present day shift in collecting practices. There is, one could argue, a major shift that is currently underway. reflected in everything from changes in reading lists on course syllabi to collecting categories in dealers' catalog. And I think you can speak to that. So who could predict it, for instance, that 1990s radical zines, graffiti books, and street literature would take their place among the Aldeans, Elseviers, and Kelmscotts? Not to say that street literature was not collected by antiquarians in the past, but certainly not with the same rationale. And the impact of technology, just as in previous centuries from antiquity to the early modern to the industrial age, has undoubtedly had an impact on the shift. In his book, University of Disaster, proto-hypermodernist Paul Virilio declares, quote, "We no longer write, we no longer read," and very nearly lamenting his observation that, quote, "notes are already written up and more often than not available on the internet," predicts the end of a reading paradigm. However, it is possible that the practice of literacy too is undergoing a shift rather than any outright eradication in long form. And that shift only augments the importance of association copies and their ability to stand as monuments to the social networks of generations past and the instruments by which they were facilitated. In the current moment, a time when following one's heart for collecting, the spirit of them, has in many ways triumphed. Following one's nose for what could be the best investment is not what it used to be. That is, of course, unless you're in the business of selling antiquarian books. Past collectors like Arturo Schomburg had the foresight in seeing the value of African Americana during a time when many of his contemporaries had ignored that area of collecting. And collectors like that have assumed greater status in the public eye. A conscious collecting that seeks to acknowledge how, for instance, in some of the great historical collections like that of Ferdinand Columbus, son of Christopher Columbus, who was, quote, given the right to the encomienda of 300 Indians, which he seems to promptly have sold to someone else, and quote, could have not existed if not for the exploitation of marginalized groups. Now that thread is present in between the lines of many of the narratives in Gigante's protagonist and supporting characters, from Matthew Carey's Black American Pressman in his employ, to Cogswell's rejection of an offer to be a plantation overseer, or even Lamb's work for the South Sea Company, his clerkship with the British East India Company, and their previous involvement of those companies with the transatlantic slave trade. Today's youngest bibliophile collectors may have a greater, quote, feel for a compassionate collecting, rather than a nose for canonicity affectations of cultural superiority, effectively rebranding canonicity by expanding its racial, gender, and class-driven boundaries. Thank you.
Heather, would you like to?
I'd be happy. Oh, we're going alphabetically. Well, I come to this book as a book dealer. And so I am fascinated by encountering a history of the New York book trade that does not begin in the Gilded Age. In my experience, when most people talk about collecting in America, and certainly collecting in New York, they are focused on the late 19th century. They want to talk about J.P. Morgan, and they want to talk in the United States more broadly about Huntington and Folger. They want to talk about the founding of the Grolier Club, the rise of the private press movement. That's very much the moment the robber barons are seen as the place where American book collecting really takes off. That's when they have the money. That's when they are extracting, like gold, enormous quantities of material out of Europe and building palaces for it here in the New World. Palaces which, in many cases, become public institutions or the core of public institutions. This is a phenomenon that I'm extremely familiar with, since it forms the backdrop of so much of my social and professional life. What was fantastic about this book for me was really beginning to get a sense of what was going on earlier in the 19th century, which I confess I had sort of thought of as sort of a hazy period that involved like Rosenbach's uncle and a bunch of sort of brownish books. And of course people were collecting, but I was thinking of it, primarily as Americana. That the early university libraries in the United States were not great. they were not amazing. It took a long time to make them what they are today. So having this kind of intense dive into the bibliophilia of the mid-19th century, and using Lamb's books, which is a genius and I think kind of provocative move, as the way to think about what Americans were doing, I liked very much. I was fascinated by the fact that Lamb, a Londoner, an Englishman, that his books found their sale in New York City, not in London, the city where he had spent his life, where his friends, where his professional connections were. And the resentment of some in England that those books were exported to the United States for sale. I was also fascinated by his son-in-law, Moxon, the publishers, who had been tasked with donating the books to University College London, felt that he actually just could not even face it because they were so shabby that it was like too embarrassing for him to even present this pile of, mutilated, torn up, annotated, falling apart books that had been repaired when they were repaired by a cobbler, by a shoemaker, not by a bookbinder. The most absolutely, ugly pile of leather. He just ultimately couldn't do it. And so he contracted with New York booksellers to sell the books in New York City across the ocean where no one could look at them very closely. This rhymes really nicely, actually, with another incident toward the end of the book, which is when an American book dealer is attempting to sell George Washington's library to the British Museum. A moment that inflames Boston and eventually results in the Boston Athenaeum being the home of that collection of books. That Washington's books do not belong in London. That is an insane place to put them. It was also, of course, influenced by the fact that sentimental collecting, that things like association copies didn't mean anything in England, and the British Library did not want to buy George Washington's books just because George Washington owned them. It already had copies of those books. From their perspective, it was not a worthy acquisition. Whereas, to Americans raised in this tradition of sentimental collecting, that was absolutely, crucial that the founder of the country's books stay in the country. I think about this all the time because as a bookseller, I'm constantly being asked, well, where do you think something belongs? Where do you think something should be placed? Where should it go? And often the easiest answer to that question is it should go where all the other stuff like that is, right? It should go to an institution that has strong holdings in this place. But in practical terms, what that often means is it should go to a very wealthy elite institution and it should consolidate the continued power of that institution rather than sending something to an unlikely place, a place where it might be one of the true highlights of the collection instead of sending it to, forgive me, the Morgan, or, which is absolutely, overflowing with riches. Or the Beinecke or the Houghton, or a library like that absolutely has the budget to buy interesting things, that has deep, deep collections. It does make sense. That's where the scholars go. Why would you send it to a small regional university? Why would you do that? Except that it's possible that at that small regional university, that book would actually get a lot more play, a lot more eyes would actually fall on it. It's possible that it would be the seed of something in a place that is probably not going to be in New Haven or Cambridge, because there's just too much to look at there, and it will simply sink into the collection to some degree. So it's something that it was interesting to see that playing out a couple centuries ago, that anxiety about place and about ownership and about power and about privilege. Who gets to own things? Who gets to have them? Who gets to share them? Who gets to set the terms of how they're shared? That was very fascinating to me. The other thing that was fascinating to me, as Jesse indicated, was the whole idea of sentimental collecting, which we can say it's because Americans are sentimental or they have bigger hearts, but really it's because Americans had absolutely no prospect of competing with the great continental libraries on the subject of book history. There was no way, and they still can't do it. The libraries of Europe had centuries to accumulate treasures, to lock down core collections. In a way that the Americans struggling to kind of put together, even the great university libraries here, I mean, they were tiny, tiny in comparison to what was happening in what was happening, what had happened, what was continuing to happen in Europe. And so, as is always the case, when you find yourself both underfunded and without opportunity, you get creative and you start valuing other things. You say, I cannot compete on this ground, but we can really understand this. And Sentimental Collective becomes a way to do that. In the United States, we're not concerned so much about priority. We're not concerned so much about condition. What we're concerned about is how do these individual copies, what are the connections? I loved the story early in this book of I think it's Edward Doikunk, who doesn't want to buy the Lamb book, but goes into the bookseller and brings his own copies of Lamb's books and copies out all of Lamb's marginalia into his own copies. Like he takes the marginalia and the bookseller lets him do it. It was just this hilarious, something that most booksellers today would actually not stand for that. But this idea that it's the connections and the idiosyncrasies, the strangeness, the weirdness of these individual annotated, associated copies, they give them their value, they make them special. And claiming grounds that's what we care about, that's what we do here in the United States, has lots of implications. And I, as someone who loves association copies and like super into this, definitely, a kind of democratic spirit to that. That what is important about books is that they travel, that they become places where lots of different people can weigh in, lots of different people can own them, can read them, can respond to them, and that the trace of that conversation, of that sort of public or private in the pages of a book, but public because it's a book which is itself open to the world, that is something to be valued and celebrated rather than a flaw to cause you to cast the book aside. So I very much enjoyed that part of the story and had not thought so much about the way that American life in the 19th century really made that a sort of natural move for not just book dealers, but also librarians and collectors, that it was the way to go forward for them, to build collections that were unlike old world collections, that had a different feeling to them, and that you could claim as a kind of national treasure. And so I really, really appreciated that aspect. I run a book collecting prize for young women, and a lot of the rationale behind it was, that many people still feel like if they don't have money to buy first editions, then they can't collect books, which is bananas. The truth is, I think that the most interesting collections are ones like Lamb's. They are ones that are driven by a kind of personal fascination. And that often does not have to be, you don't have to be picking up expensive books. It's more about the quality of your vision and how well you're able to execute something that you have personally come up with. Coming up, and the sort of more out there or unusual the subject, the better it is in a way, the more of a contribution you're making, rather than just taking a standard bibliography and checking off the books as you wrap them up. It was a real thrill for me in that sense to see that was, I knew it was not a new project, but also that it was like, in a way, a characteristically American project. That was something that made me feel, as I do not often feel these days, patriotic. And so I appreciated that aspect of this history, which I feel like has really enriched my sense, not just of the history of the trade or the history of collecting, but the history of the way that books live in the world and what they mean to conversations that cross oceans, that cross continents. So those are my remarks.
Thank you so much, Leah, for having me, and Jesse and Heather, and of course Denise. And in the spirit, I'm going to offer some associational remarks. So this week I was invited to 2 events focusing on Charles Lamb. Tomorrow, Deirdre Lynch is talking about Lamb's many kinds of writing, his calligraphy, from his work as an accountant to his essays in marginalia. And today, of course, we're here to discuss Denise's enormously erudite book, Madness, which, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading it, examines the romantic poet, essayist, and book collector Charles Lamb's library and follows the sale and dispersal of those books in early 19th century America. Through tracing the purchases of these volumes, we find out about New York City's Shakespearean societies, the antiquarian movement in Boston, and the origin of the collection that would become the NYPL. But 2 events within 24 hours of each other about Charles Lamb. Why might Lamb be having a moment? Several insights from Denise's book suggest why Lamb might be helpful for thinking about book culture now. To start, it might be his mixture of reverence and irreverence for books, treasuring and rereading a limited library, and yet also writing in them, cutting them up, lending them out, and allowing them to fall into disrepair. It's a non-precious seriousness about using objects that offers an approach to living in relation to things that feels both sustainable but not austere. And maybe it's that Lamb had to make a living. The beloved friend of Coleridge and inventive writer was also a working stiff, employed by day as a clerk at the East India Company, and in doing so separated work and reading. In an age when many culture workers feel pressured to monetize their hobbies, cultivating a Twitter profile around their reading habits or generating a profitable social media persona by sharing every waking moment of the day, what might Lamb's approach teach us? Lamb is also the guide of the hour for me for a different reason, which I'll share because I often find that grad students are curious. How do you go from getting a PhD in English to curating rare books and archives? In some ways, I identify with the sharp-tongued Lamb when he begged Coleridge, "Don't call me a poet." And in moving from adjunct professor to professional book buyer, steward of special collections, and librarian, I entered a territory that Denise so vividly describes, of the bibliophile obsessives who have no time to read, of librarians overwhelmed by material, yet looking both covetously and fearfully at any new potential acquisition. I moved into a sphere where the graduate school discussions about literary criticism, dematerializing, and decontextualizing are central, but in a kind of obvious way. Of course, the question of materiality in historical context matters, and yet also, and Heather referred to this, rare artifacts zip around the world, changing hands, ending up in the British Museum, say, when clearly they should be in Greece, or disappearing into private collections and sometimes becoming entirely lost to the public, so that of course they also have odd and incomplete connections to their place of origin. Denise alludes to both the problem of lost books and the issue of being overwhelmed by them. So instead of eager acquisitiveness, I want to start with a slightly different story. I work at Columbia University, where the heart of the literary collections are the publishers' archives that document the making of books, primarily in America, through correspondence with editors, early rough drafts, contracts, memoranda of payments, disputes with lawyers, and even shelved projects. And many of the names of these publishing houses will be familiar to readers of Denise's book, including HarperCollins and Scribner. Recently, I've been working to acquire the archives of a well-known literary agent who helped revolutionize publishing lists from the 1970s to 90s, representing Sandra Cisneros, Julia Alvarez, and the historian Eduardo Galeano. Susan, the agent, helped Latinx writers break into major publishing houses, but also helped change the way writers were paid, devising new kinds of contracts that allowed authors to keep publishing rights for future formats. Susan also has a habit of taking notes whenever she's talking to anyone, a priceless habit for researchers, because her archive documents who said what in every meeting about publishing, say, The House on Mango Street. Her archive captures biographies of books, how they were made and put out into the world, and it will be an important addition to Columbia's archives if it happens. But part of the reason Susan was talking to me surfaced during the second conversation when she said, "Hey, I heard Columbia takes books." For those of you familiar with research libraries, you might think, well, of course they do. But in fact, what Susan was referring to is that virtually no one will take those books. Libraries really want her papers, those documents that are unique, but published books, even pristine, potentially expensive ones on the open market, do I want those for a research library? No, not really. I'll leave the Susan story for now, but what commenced was a negotiation that was not at all unusual. I will consider selling you my papers if you will also take my books. Today, many libraries are in this situation, having their arms twisted to take the codices. So why wouldn't we want them? Part of it's intuitive. First editions are valuable to collectors, like art, but have limited research value, especially if the library already has a copy of the same volume. But perhaps an as important reason is one of those hidden undercurrents of institutions that shapes everything but generally goes unnoticed, like rules around early voting or zoning laws in cities. And that is what we call the backlog. The backlog is the portion of a library or museum's collections that are purchased, they're on site, but they're unprocessed. They are owned by the library and part of its collection, but they have not been organized by an archivist or cataloger. They might not have been added to an electronic searchable database, and their collection record may be entirely suppressed. So they are what we call hidden collections or unfindable by researchers. At the institution where I worked previously, the backlog could be measured in decades, meaning items bought in the 1980s could still be sitting in cartons uncatalogued. At the institution where I work now, bear with me while I throw some rough numbers at you. Of the bibliographic materials, there are 6,000 cataloged ancient writing services and 1,000 uncatalogued ones. There are about 500,000 cataloged rare books and 135,000 uncatalogued ones. Of the ephemera, including pamphlets, serials, and sheet music, there are 15,000 cataloged items, and we estimate 150,000 uncatalogued ones. This means that there are just under 300,000 uncatalogued items, or 58%. So more than half of Columbia's bibliographic collections are unprocessed. The story is slightly better for archives, though not by much. 30% of the library's more than 100,000 linear feet of archives are unprocessed. And the story is worse for oral histories, graphic materials, and I won't even go into artwork or digital media where the percent catalog might be in the single digits. These numbers grow with each acquisition. I was recently working on a project related to the Avid Said archive. Said was a literary critic, theorist, and activist, and he worked at Columbia, and he was a capacious reader in multiple languages and across genres. The library purchased his archive a couple of decades ago, and his papers were swiftly processed. But when I joined Columbia, I found about 15 boxes labeled Said books in our vault. These were the books from his office, documenting what he was reading and working on at the end of his career. And in looking through the cartons, I found the books were covered with notes. He was a huge annotator, and it was a totally overlooked treasure. But because of the backlog, it would be years before they were individually cataloged. So instead, I made an Excel list and we added the titles to the finding date of his collection. So these books are not individually searchable, but they are findable in a manner speaking. In looking back at the acquisition file, I also saw how the then director of the library repeatedly wrote, "We need to distinguish the Said archive from the Said books. It's the archive we want. The books artificially inflate the size of the collection." So the papers were processed and the books went into processing limbo for the next 20 years. So why does this matter? The backlog is a product of both cultural and financial forces, and it jeopardizes the guiding missions of these cultural institutions. Archives, libraries, and museums are given a dual charge of collecting materials and making them accessible. On the one hand, libraries are repositories for preserving documents for future generations. And on the other, they are supposed to open these records up for research and use now. This balance is swayed by many considerations: the privacy of living donors, setting priorities, and thinking about the physical delicacy of objects. But what does it mean to have a really long backlog? It's fulfilling half of the mission. preserving as much as possible, bringing it into the library, while violating the other half, making those materials available to the public for use and research. This is an undercurrent, I think, throughout Denise's work, and a tension that I would say animates the activities of some of the bibliophiles she describes. So it's possible the tension I'm talking about is not so much a product of the modern research library, and I'd love to hear Denise's thoughts on this, but is rather an issue that can be traced back. And many of the structural reasons that supercharge this tension can also be traced back to this era. First, the acquisition budget of major libraries, and Heather referred to this. And here I'm talking about maybe 10 places in the US, are endowed by donors with special interests, and sometimes they are attached to specific areas of collecting. Like I have a fund specifically for buying items related to Samuel Beckett. But nearly always the money is earmarked for the exciting activity of buying books, and not the less sexy activities of cataloging them, boxing them, paging them, and bringing them out to readers. Secondly, and relatedly, the work of acquisition and care are often entirely separate. Curators collect, and that's our mandate. We buy, and sometimes that means that in relation to the other workers in the library, we are considered a problem, buying at a rate that the other workers cannot keep up with, and so the backlog grows even longer. And in our defense, in some cases, donor funds require that you spend them each year. Moreover, the rate of capital growth over the past 30 years means that these endowed funds have grown, so the mandate to buy is stronger, and the richest institutions have left their peers behind, making it nearly impossible for smaller local institutions to compete in the open market. So to conclude, what should we do about this? One solution is what I described in the Edward Said example: treat books like archives, not individual objects. Erase the distinction between individual books and a collection. This, as you can imagine, has some downsides. But another solution is to focus on what Denise has drawn out, the labor of collecting. In today's parlance, this is called the, quote, total cost of acquisition. So when a collection is purchased, it's not estimated at the price of the collection on the open market, or even the inherent research interest of the books or the archive itself, but as the cost of the institution. How many hours of an archivist's time what will it cost to keep these items air conditioned for the next 100 years? What if you have to buy more New Jersey real estate to warehouse them? But most of all, the human labor that goes along with the purchase of rare books in archives takes center stage. Or what is the total cost of care? This is one of the questions I was thinking about while reading the part of Book Madness when Denise describes the work of Joseph Caldwell to collect the tens of thousands of books that would form the heart of the New York Public Library, still one of the greatest research collections in New York City, possibly the greatest. Caldwell has had to endure many of the indignities of collectors, putting up with the wealthy, ultimately tight-fisted John Jacob Astor. But then perhaps the greatest sacrifice was that he stopped having the time or the inclination to read. He said that he was spiritually distant from books and sick of the very sight of them. The emotional demands put on librarians have been given a name in library scholarship: vocational awe. That is, as idealized public servants, fueled by the ethic of service, helping others, or often asked to take on work that outstrips the tasks they are officially paid to do, librarians themselves often aspire to fulfill these outsized expectations because, in part, they too understand being a librarian is a vocation and a calling, not just a job. The bibliomaniacs don't precisely use this language, but it's a heady brew of spiritual fulfillment, public service, and for private collectors, a dash of entrepreneurial capitalism. So part of the total cost of care then is the cost to librarians. I've outlined a couple of disheartening trends in the public institutions that are inheritors of the era Denise described: the way libraries don't always want books, the way they can't adequately steward and make accessible the collections they have, and the sometimes undue burdens placed on library workers. Taken literally, this might forecast a library without bookishness, if not without books. In this diagnosis, institutions are the spoilers of bibliophilia. So perhaps too obvious question for Denise is, should we or how can we try to turn back the clock and recover book issues institutionally? But although libraries are institutions of preservation, they're also sites of change. There's been a great deal of occupational diversification and a shift in norms of librarianship. And part of this is making clear how much work it is to take care of books and to take care of the people who are taking care of books. This, I think, will allow an expanded, albeit perhaps as book mad and cacophonous, idea of what collecting should be moving forward. So thank you, Denise, for this wonderful book, and I look forward to talking more about it.
That was amazing. 3 very different, very rich perspectives. Thank you so much. I don't even know where to begin, but I kind of want to pick up, since there were a couple of questions here, maybe we can think through together. I have responses for everything, but when I began this book, so I began this book 20 years ago, so it was a long time in the making. I began it because I found, as those of you who will read the epilogue will know, a copy accidentally in special collections in the Stanford University libraries of William Carey Hazlitt's edition of The Lambs, their friends, their letters, etc. And it had been owned by a former 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century bibliomaniac who had used it as a kind of scrapbook, really, to track down, his goal was to track down all of Lamb's books in America. So he pasted in, he had corresponded with the author, Hazlitt, he had pasted in a handwritten letter from Hazlitt, he had pasted in a typed letter from Charles Eliot Norton, he had pasted in auction catalogs, sale catalogs, notes, he had interviewed booksellers, his own marginalia, he had asked people to scribble in the margins. So it was just this fascinating thing sitting there of a bibliomaniac, in his case, fascination with the association copies from Lamb's library. And I thought, well, he didn't get very far. He interviewed Robert Clark, who knew somebody who, but he didn't have the resources really to dive full time into it. And that was the seed of the project. But what really intrigued me was the mystery of it all, right? Like, who were these? Heather is absolutely right and most librarians will be able to tell you that American book history begins in the post-Civil War era, in the Gilded Age. It's a prehistory, really, that this is. And therefore, there was a lot that was unknown about it. And when I began the book 20 years ago, Wikipedia was brand new, nothing, well, not nothing, but very little had been digitized. You needed to go to the archives to do this work. And so, and to find out who these people were, you needed to read their letters. And so little of it has been categorized in the way that you're explaining. And yet, so for example, when I used the Thomas Crofton Croker collection of manuscripts at Princeton, I needed to hire a graduate student to transcribe them. I needed to go to Brown and read through the handwritten letters. None of those were cataloged. I needed to go into the Joycake family papers at the NYPL to look at all of the materials in boxes from Everett and George Blum Joycake to find out what was happening at the time and piece together a story. And so in a sense, and now by the end of the book, I could go back to the NYPL digitized archives page, look up the Joycake family papers, and find connections that I hadn't seen before because, you know, all of William Jones's letters are up, or you know, there were things that I hadn't seen connected to it. So that was a good thing, but I'm not sure the book would have sustained, I would have been able to sustain interest in the book if there weren't an element of mystery to it. When I went, I spent a month at the Massachusetts Historical Society, same thing, just reading through letters. None of the letters have been cataloged or, you know, given subject matter or anything, to find the stories, you know, to draw out the stories that were there. And so you know, I'm of two minds. I mean, again, by the end of the project, Google Books was an invaluable resource for me. You know, largely because a lot of them they're facsimiles, so you can see who owns them often, you know, but there are only a few libraries participating in the project. So you know, if I had known who these people were, if, you know, if I had their voices, and if everything was like indexed and cross-referenced and done, it wouldn't have been the same kind of thing. I wouldn't have been like calling for an associational, like, you know, study of like a living literary history, the people who lived in and through books. I mean, it was bringing it to life in a way that is hard for us to remember. You know, every interaction involves a quotation and a literary reference, you know, a connection. And so I'm of mixed minds. I think in a way there's a pretty easy answer to the problem of the backlog, which is, hey, 5 boxes in this collection contain, you know, just as it's done, like containing these writers, go to it, you know. Do I need to know what every letter is, when it was written, who it was? I mean, I don't know. It would be really interesting to talk about. I think it would make my life easier if I knew what I was looking for, but I'm not sure that I would have had the discoveries I had or the stories that I had come out of it if I knew what I was looking for, if that makes sense. So it is that tension that you were talking about too, Jesse, between like the privilege of being able to go to an archive, you know, sustained by a certain kind of, you know, research account, job security, et cetera, versus the democratic impulse of making everything available digitally, and the tension between the two, right? I don't think one or the other is ideal, you know. Again, I think that the digitized version of looking at these materials was useful in the second phases of the book when it had all come together and I was looking for the finer details, you know, and connections and adding things to it. But going into an archive and not knowing what you're looking for and spending several weeks there transcribing letters, you know, is a certain kind of work that I hadn't done before, frankly, and that's why I undertook this project. I hadn't done really this kind of archival research in the past, and I wanted to see what it was about, and this is exactly what it was about for me. So I don't know if that makes sense to you as a response, but you know, it really is true that the people, many of the people involved in the story who were cataloging and collecting and organizing and shelving and indexing gave their lives to it. And it was hard work. Often it was dry work. You know, Cogswell had to take down at one point 60,000 books off warehouse shelves and check it against his list.
I'm done now.
You've done that?
Oh, yeah, stop reading.
And, you know, he said, if I had known going into it how much work it was going to be, I would have been afraid to start, you know. And so that kind of thing, you know, is really about the selflessness of trying to make literary culture and material and say historical information available to a public. It's about a devotion to the project of education in a more general sense than, you know, 4 years of an elite institution or any institution. It's about continuing self-culture. That's what the 19th century was about. It was about, many of these men finished school at 14 and went to work. And what did you do? You stopped your intellectual life? No, you continued it around the margins of a working life. Continuing education was the mode of the day. If America was to be educated, it was going to have to create athenaeums. It was going to have to create its own lecture circuit, public talks, public events, a history on medieval culture for the New York Historical Society. I mean, this was a public intellectual culture, which has become more professionalized. It still exists in places like the Grolier Club or the Philadelphia Athenaeum or the Boston Athenaeum or the American Antiquarian Society, but it doesn't have the kind of numbers that it used to, so but the nose, is really worth remarking on because, so the nose was really theorized by John Carter, who was in the 1950s. He was an English bookseller. He was from London, and he wrote with that kind of T.S. Eliot wit that was at once offensive and yet at the same time really delightful, so snobbish. And he said, it's much easier. You have to tell to be able to discover. So the nose is that once the sign of connoisseurship associated with privilege. So if you think about going to a wine tasting, right? You go to the wine tasting and the bouquet is all about the flavor, which the sense of smell is essential too. And taste is subject to smell in that occasion. You just need the tiniest taste to be able to judge. And you spit it out. You don't even swallow it. It's about the suppression of appetite, because you're not doing this because you're thirsty, right? Or this is about cultural performance. And so the nose has that associated with it in book culture, to be able to tell a fine edition or a fine binding, or who the binder was, to be able to recognize that. At one end of the spectrum. The nose for the antiquarians was somebody like Henry Stevens Jr., who was a scholar of American history, bibliographer and bookseller, who probably did more than anybody else at mid-century to keep books moving back and forth, antiquarian books about America across the Atlantic. And he had a nose that led him to recognize what was important in these kind of random collections in barnyards and things, right? He was able to, he had a talent for knowing what was important instantaneously. That was a kind of nose. And then there was then what becomes the sentimental nose? Like, is there a sentimental nose? I mean, does Charles Lamb going to the bookstalls, and finding that damaged copy of Robert Burton or something, or into the back room of a book stall, does that count as a nose? I don't know,
I think that, John Carter, in talking about the nose, really distinguishes it usefully from the eye. That an eye for books is something that can be trained. That with experience, by handling lots of copies, you can look at a shelf and say, oh, that is a fine copy of that book. Yes, and you will know the points. That's something that anyone who works hard at it can develop. But that the nose is a sense for what is special that you have not learned, that you have not seen before. There are some people who can go into a room and pluck off the shelf something very special, and no one else knows how they did it because no one ever saw that book before. No one knew what was good about it, but they just have a sense. It's a kind of connoisseurship, but it's not based on formal education. It's based on a kind of sensibility or sensitivity to what's going on in the book that some people have and some people don't, and that's hard to train for.
Right. So Carter's book is called Taste and Technique in Book Collecting. Technique is what you can learn. It's a set of skills associated with book collecting. taste is what you can't really learn. You can't buy taste, right? You can't go and like pay a college to give it to you. You have to work for it. However, this distinction is ideological because it goes back to the beginnings, it goes back to neoclassicism and the beginning of the discussion of taste in general, right? So you've got like you've got the aristocrats who are trying to hold on to taste, say when it's being taken away from them by the revolutionaries who are, causing restaurants to be opened and the middle classes to have access to high cuisine, for example, to take an analogy. But the aristocrats hang on to the je ne sais quoi, right? Like, okay, you guys might have conduct manuals to teach you how to demonstrate or perform taste. You may be able to go to a restaurant and learn a set of skills for what to order. But the je ne sais quoi it's Princess and the Pea. It's just, I don't know how I know it. And if I knew how I knew it, and I could give you a reason for it, then I wouldn't be special. So I think with the book, kind of Carter's fetishization of the nose, I don't know what to say about that. Like, there must be something to it. At the same time, it's also the je ne sais quoi, right? Some people have a genius for some things, but most of it is what you were describing, like the ability to be able to recognize fine bindings or additions, or to learn about paper or margins, right? And the uncut editions say it all, right? Like bibliomaniacs have to have these uncut editions on their shelves because they're in the pristine form that they were born in, but nobody's read them. So I think that's a really interesting, and I also really love what you're saying about the nose, also the anthropomorphic version of it being a class distinguisher, right? Everybody has nose jobs, right? Not because they don't like their nose necessarily, but because it doesn't conform to a certain class.
It's all about power.
Yeah.
It's all about power in that sense, of what you're saying about the je ne sais quoi of the aristocracy and the the offense that they take when the masses become the arbiters of cool, right? And what's in vogue and what's the taste they want. There's a certain battle for ownership of that. That's why I referenced Arturo Schomburg at the end, because he was a liberation collector. He collected for the sort of ideal of the vision of, this is important for us because other people are ignoring it and we have to preserve our own history because they say that we don't have one, right? And who knew? It took so many generations for people to care about that. We're only in that moment now, right? And you can say, oh, well, he was a genius. He had a nose for that. But did he? And it's a question. It's a question because the nose as a construct is really trying to capture so much. It's trying to distill, essentially.
Right.
There's
exactly.
so many social dynamics into one sort of mysterious, intentionally vague reference to something that's like, oh, well, they have it or you don't. How fair is that?
Then there's like Woody Allen, right? It's the sense that you can reconstruct a whole personality from this complex idea, really. There's also the actual, I would say the fourth category would be the actual nose, which, loves, I got a tour of the Grolier 2 nights ago, and Eve Kahn, who's introducing me to it, my students basically. I love this room the best because it has the smell of old books, And a former bibliomaniac I knew who was with me in special collections saw a certain volume and he smelled the whole thing. And do you smell the smoke in this book? This book was, on a hearth fire being read. He had this whole narrative that just generated in his mind. Flaubert's Bibliomaniac, it's a novella, runs around smelling manuscripts. So there is an element of like physical interaction that involves that.
Yeah, that came up in another talk that I think we will both on in and I refer to that as a fetish, right? And immediately got some pushback for that, and I was convinced in real time that there's something more to it because I was introduced to this whole area of research around aroma and smell as a way to get into history. And I forget who, but somebody referenced that they were able to advance their bibliographical research from the smell of the volume because you knew that a certain glue that was used, in a country was not present in the country that was on the imprint. And so, this led him to, find, where the book was actually published. But so smell is definitely not arbitrary, even though we do sort of fetishize it. It's one of the aspects of the book that we fetishize. Like, oh, we love the smell of books, we love the smell of books. But there is something more to it. I'm convinced now there's something much more to it.
I would say that my colleagues in preservation who deal with cleaning the books, caring for the books, restitching and binding, probably have an entirely different emotional array around smell, and it's primarily alarm. So that if you can smell, I mean, they also tell me this, like when you're visiting the collection, like, do you smell anything? What does the place smell like? And basically they're asking, like, is it molded?
Yeah, sure.
But so, I mean, I think that, that very fine sense of smell, but also it's a sort of like house alarm, which is like, the preservationists will say, just like, back away. Don't talk to me about reading those books in the library.
I mean, it's all symbolic, I mean, the unsmelling book is associated with like the state of disinterested taste, right? I'm the subjective observer. I can give you correct taste. That was the Enlightenment term, correct taste. I don't smell the book. It's in perfect preservation. If it starts to gain an odor or what they might have called interest in the 18th century, or say enthusiasm or something else, then it's off the chart of the, of the polite and correct. And I think that it's a complete flip-flop from, earlier ideas, ancient ideas of aesthetics, which prioritized vision. It had taste and smell at the bottom, because these were bodily senses. Taste and hearing were associated with cognitive processes, with philosophy, with male definitions of culture. Once you get to taste, it's middle classes, it involves women, and then smell, which is at the very bottom of the hierarchy of the senses, traditionally speaking, comes to the top with food, when food enters the sphere of fine art, right? And it becomes this complex that it never had been before. It used to be only offensive odors that assaulted you from outside, bad taste in perfume, foul odors, assaulting your sense of, privileged subjectivity. But now it involves a kind of agency.
Thanks. These were really interesting. So I'm a late 19th century Americanist who does a little bit of work on collecting and associational thinking around magazines. I would love to think some about modes of association. The conversation so far is kind of, to the extent that we're talking about noses and collections, it's individuals interacting with the books. And I was trying to imagine the different modalities of association that take shape. And sentimental association is certainly one, but there are lots of other kinds of associations that one can imagine within books. And I'm thinking kitsch might be one, listening to the folks in the Grolier Club last night smelling. Kitsch, innovation, the idea of people in the know, so a kind of association, but also a disjunction, making sure that there are people who are not in the know who aren't picking things up. So I was just thinking, I'd love to hear more about the associational history that you came across, a little bit more about sentimentality and the role of sentimentality in that, and if there are other modes of, if we could just think like, what are the modes of association that books seem to attract. Is there something particular about the kinds of books that are attracting these associational modes?
You know, there's two things that you brought up, but I would say in terms of modes of association, you know, there are various ways. So there's the association copy of the book, which is a connection between an owner and a former owner. There's the William Hazlitt associational connection of a reader, a passionate reader with a particular author or character, you know, Tom Jones or something. And that can take, you know, has kind of a dual phenomenology, because it could be fictional or authorial. There's the associational relation between the book and the place that it's in, which involves a whole range of situational, historical references. And then there's the relation between the self reading at the moment or handling the book or looking at the book, self with the book, and former instantiations of the self that are linked together through the book, right? So you pick up this book that you read when you were 5, and then you've got this extended version of subjectivity that you couldn't get in any other way. And Hazlitt argues this gorgeously. And then there's larger, more social modes of association in which people come together around books. So you have literally associations. So the mercantile library association, right? Associations of merchants who get together to build a library that they can use and come together and discuss things other than commerce, right? Cultural associations. You can put historical societies and academies and lyceums and everything else in that category. Associations can lead across different media. So you can have, you know, say a text producing marginalia, which produces an illustration of it, which then becomes, you know, say a dedicatory object given to somebody. These are the kind of stories told in the book. So there are ways of bringing people together. Epistolary association is a huge one, you know, where there was all of this correspondence that grew between people who didn't know each other that began in books. So for example, Doyking meets George Templeton Strong, who's this really interesting character, a diarist of early New York, but also a bibliomaniac, whose father was George Washington Strong, which I like, who he never might have met. I don't know. I mean, so that's the modality. Then there's the other thing, which is the literary history part. And I would say that there's always a little bit of stubbornness in me. So if there's like a literary trend, I react against it instinctively. And so there had been this idea that you can't have any kind of associational anything in producing literary criticism, because it just means you're an amateur. You have to have, like, if you're a historian, you have to have an actual influence connection to be able to talk about this, like causality. If you're a literary critic, you have to have some direct theoretical, you know, something. Whereas association is associated with belletrism, with the kind of literary essay that used to be written, you know, oh, and this reminds me of this, who cares? Well, you know, I mean, we're going back to a kind of public intellectualism because it has certain pleasures that people crave, you know, and that academia doesn't provide, or that professional criticism doesn't provide. That's an enormous trend right now.
And I would just also say that, you know, that, as you say, that the kind of unprofessional associationalism that is often derided in strictly academic circles, the pursuit of a vibe, which connects a bunch of things, and which is absolutely driving so much social media around books and reading right now. I feel like we are entering an associational sort of renaissance of people who are linking things together in very idiosyncratic and impressionistic ways to make something that would not stand up as a directly logical connection, but then nonetheless, when done well, shows you something, shows you a network of things that you wouldn't otherwise expect. It's one, I think, of the great pleasures of social media, that you can see that, the development of those associations, like little brain cells reaching out for connection or whatever.
Or people reaching out.
Yeah.
for connection, right? I mean, I had a colleague, Franco Moretti, who, when he was at Stanford, championed what is known as the digital humanities. And it was method, it's all about method. That's what trumped everything else. And so I challenged him to a debate, which actually never ended up happening for various reasons, about, I said, look, I'm going to talk about the value of associational, this kind of a literary history versus, your method where your computer can link together things statistically, and he was all pleased and was ready to. And again, the reasons that didn't happen have nothing to do with cowardice, but that's, you kind of tapped into kind of founding gesture. It's also in my book Taste, it's like in the introduction there a little bit, like I don't believe that literary critics need to be able to show evidence that something has influenced something else. I think they need to be interesting, and if there's a connection there, that's what's the word, viable, right? I care more if you're interesting than if you're correct, really. I mean, that's the sort of staple of Blake criticism.
I think one thing I'll add is that institutionally, there's, and I think Denise would like this is sort of happenstance or accident or momentum around associational collections.
Exactly.
So, different universities have different specialties, and the Morgan has different treasures that then tend to accumulate other treasures. And they often are named after somebody else so at Columbia, there's this amazing collection of 19th century pedagogical materials that George Plimpton collected. Why was he interested in those? I'm not really sure. But now this just priceless collection of sort of like DIY, how to do astronomy for children in 1870, thousands of these things. They're all called the Plimpton collection, and people from around the world, they come to use the Plimpton collection, which has, so it has, and that's at every institution that I've worked at, has these accidental associations, which are related to the institutional history, but they also have this sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy to them, and they will probably always be this way.
Well, sometimes they're not so accidental. Sometimes it's written into the, bequest agreement. I'm donating these thousands of books and this fund that this endowed fund that you can, draw upon for perpetuity, with the expectation that you will be spending that money on books related to the course.
That I would have liked if I was still alive.
Exactly. So you definitely see both, and Morgan is very much, built around collections that, were the legacies of donors, starting with Morgan himself, and then expanding out to
It's important to underline that that's how American institutional collections were built.
Right.
They were built in the 19th century by individual collectors and there's a difference between a collection and a pile of books, right? A true collection of any sort that's not a great aristocratic library has, in theory anyway, has to have it has to have some sense of what makes it a collection, right? What gives it personality. If it's just a random collection of books, it's not much of a collection. It's not.
So a lot of what So I'm thinking a lot about commonplacing and sort of how it's like this other side of association copies, right? It's like this different kind of record for reading and interest. And I'm wondering if you all can sort of like delve into what that difference is. Is it just like the object? Because I think that, you know, when we're thinking about like who is able to have an association copy that matters or that is documented or ends up in a library and is cataloged, right? There's a class and a race and a gender component to that, whereas like a commonplace book or a commonplace list doesn't require book ownership and thus might sort of skirt some of those, but is that an assumption? I'm wondering if these are as parallel as I'm sort of thinking they are.
I'll jump in on this one quickly. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. In that you can have both and you could have a zeal and passion for a particular subject, a particular author, a combination of them, and then build a collection of those materials and then put them in a commonplace book as part of oftentimes commonplace books have a number of quotations, examples from a range of authors. So I think they started as more of like a rhetorical tool, for the sort of erasure, kind of aspect of society and its interaction with literature. So there is an oratory component, like how do I compare, what are the best quotations I could use in public speaking and what have you. However, there's a sort of larger world that's commonplace books with scrapbooks and things like that. And you just see such a variety, and as somebody who's interested in scrapbooks, you see such a variety of literary scrapbooks being made. Sometimes they're dedicated to an author, for instance, including newspaper clippings and whatever they can find about that author. Or sometimes, you have grangerized volumes. That's all sort of part of that universe. And I don't think that, it does, the commonplace book, you have access to that. There's sort of immediacy to the access, of course, because you and a pen or you and a pair of scissors or a combination thereof, and you can sort of interact and create association to your own sentimentality in that way. But I don't think that precludes then, building a collection of books around the subject author, et cetera.
I think that commonplacing definitely is associational, of course, right? What is great about a really rich commonplace book is you're getting a snapshot of the reading and the interior life of someone at a very particular moment. You're getting to see what their horizon was and what was striking to them. What I wouldn't want to lose sight of, though, is that, the association copies, like the one that Lamb had, part of the thrill of those books was touching something that Lamb himself touched and holding that. And that's not the case with commonplace books. Commonplace books are, more open to everyone in the sense that anyone can start one anywhere for any reason, but they do lack that kind of talismanic quality, which is very much a part of what was going on with Lamb's library, where these broken, busted books brought, huge sums because not huge sums, but considerable sums, sums more than the merely monetary value of those copies.
Can I respond? Oh, okay. So we were talking last night at an event at the NYPL so I had invited Jillian Hess, who's just this couple of months ago published, actually just now, a book called How the Romantics and Victorians Organized Information. That wasn't actually her title, but it's scrapbooks, commonplace books, and albums, and the distinctions and unities between them. And, there's something at the NYPL cataloged as Charles Lamb's commonplace book. But if you look at it, A, it's an album, and B, it wasn't Lamb's. So it began as a book that Mary Lamb used, his sister, to write recipes for gooseberry wine and other things. She gave it to her friend, Sarah Hazlitt, who William Hazlitt married, unfortunately for her. She turned it over and turned it into an album, a friendship album. So you have all sorts of people writing poetry in it. Lamb indexed it at the back because he couldn't stand really to have miscellaneous things that didn't have an index. He should go to work for the. Then Hazlitt grabbed it from Sarah and used it as a blank notebook to take parliamentary notes when he was a journalist. And today, if you look at it, it says Charles Lamb's book, which once was William Hazlitt's. And it was neither of theirs. Do you see what I mean? And it wasn't even a commonplace book. So it's an interesting field. It does have a kind of talismanic quality because it's all handwritten.
Yeah. You told a story too about Lamb giving it as an autograph, or contributing to an autograph book under the best, which I like. So, you think of commonplace books as being books that are totally under your own volition, right?
Well, those were albums.
Sure. So I was going to make the distinction that, those are, I think what you were suggesting is that maybe, and especially in the 18th century, like young women would have commonplace books, but they wouldn't, as frequently have like these association copies. So I think that's what you're referring to as sort of having a different subjectivity. And as Heather said, association copies sometimes have no evidence except for either written history or oral history that these books are what you think they are. So there's at the binding key of the Bible that Charles I had when he was imprisoned, and there was this sort of whole debate about like how much to pay for it because there was no evidence. There's nothing written in it. You can't like fingerprint the Bible. So like if you think it is what it is, and because you think that, there's this talismanic quality, and therefore it enters the library with that history and becomes that thing. What was I going with this? But I was going to just solicit that Denise tell this story where sometimes you have the reverse commonplace book. You don't get to control it, but you're asked to sign things and sort of come up with quippy things to write in other people's books. And Charles Lamb, I guess, was good at that.
Everybody wanted
him to do that.
His autograph writing. There was a trend in collecting in the 19th century, which gained the name autographomania, where people wanted, that was another thing people collected. I have, Mary Lamb's autograph, I have Charles Lamb's autograph, not necessarily just the signature, but, autograph writing. And marginalia feeds that, but what was the point? What was, it just completely.
Lamb didn't want to write.
Yeah.
It was a trend, it was a parlor epic, but you're absolutely right though, that, women kept these books, as associational pieces that they asked friends, lovers, family members to write in. And these books have been neglected. Nobody cares about them. Why? Largely because it's a feminized genre. And this is what Jillian just writes about so brilliantly. The connection between the commonplace book, as you were describing its origins and rhetoric, like being quotations, handwritten quotations from writing, turning into, in the 19th century, scrapbooks, where now paper was cheap, so you pasted things in. Lamb's books are missing lines of poetry, names. One wonders if those didn't go into some scrapbook somewhere. And then the album, the friendship album, which was all autograph writing, and the ways they work together. But that commonplace book tradition in the 19th century bore various names. It bore the names of friendship albums and scrapbooks. And again, there are tons of them sitting in archives in the NYPL that are just amazing. And it's an unstudied genre because of its lack of connection with Lamb or Hazlitt. It's got Mary Lamb and Sarah Hazlitt.
So we have a question in the room from Tom Fulton, but before that, I just wanted to voice a couple of questions from the remote participants. One from Ariana McQuillan, I'm summarizing, has to do with how the writing of this book has changed your own collecting practices. And for anyone who can't see it on camera, Denise is making a face. And
Started my own collecting practice.
and the other question from Nika Mavrodi has to do with the relation between literary critical reading and reading of literature by people who are not literary critics. What do people who study literature do methodologically that people who read don't, which I guess I might give a twist to that question by asking how far you think of your methods in this book as being literary critical methods as opposed to historical methods that have an intellectual history of literature as its, or a social history of literature as its object.
So in a sense, it is a cultural history because it tries to recreate a world of bookishness and book love. But it does try to go beyond that to forge a path for literary criticism because, you know, I do readings of the poems that Lamb copied into his books in the context of those particular books, where they were in the book, what they related to, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a way in which reading a poem in, say, a void or an anthology really can be quite different than reading a poem as copied into another text. So I would say that that would be the main literary critical element of this, other than rethinking literary history as something that was a lived phenomenon. You know, so there's cultural history, which is, you could say, okay, well, this is what happened, or there's intellectual history. But then there's this way in which literature comes to life in the theaters, in conversation. And I don't know, I kind of think that's a little bit more than cultural history. I do think that's a kind of living literary history because you can think of enthusiasm as a motivating concept for that kind of, I mean, enthusiasm is another thing that's denigrated in academic literary criticism. You know, it's embarrassing, right? And I would say that is a difference, right? That these bibliophiles were not afraid to show a kind of larger than life connection to these books, right? That went beyond analysis and showed the ways in which literature frames our perspectives on a daily basis. I don't know if that makes sense to you as being distinct from cultural history or intellectual history, but I do think it is. I think it involves different strands that aren't there. And what do they do differently, literary critics? Yeah, well, I would say that there's some way to address that. My own collecting practices, I made a face because I had a sabbatical year to finish the book, and this was in 2000 like, I don't know, 9, 11. It was something really embarrassingly ancient. And I just spent the whole year collecting. You know, I didn't write any of the book. I was just collecting book.
What did you collect around?
Mainly 18th century literature in the British tradition. I'm particularly interested in essay, poetry and essay. If you were not, you know, but basically, I would say also the books that Lamb and his peers were reading, and pulling that all together, and strangely, my aesthetic taste for books as objects matched theirs. I mean, it really. I began to, you know, really dislike 17th century bindings. I very much preferred 18th century. I hated double columns. I didn't like the dual tone title page. So it just got out of hand, and it bled over into furniture collecting and things. Yeah. So all my money for my scholarship, so I had to do penance for many years after that. It was an obsessive compulsive.
Yes.
You can't control it. It controls you, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I get you started.
So that's my main phase. Yes, it wasn't a question. It was a good question.
Great, so we have time for one
Do
last
we,
question.
do we have
Tom.
time? I'm fascinated by your work, and I'm just, I'm coming to this, having been part of the used book line of scholarship that's interested in looking at the notes that are in books, like the Bill Sherman's work that, when he went to the Huntington Library and basically counted all the books in the Huntington Library that had notes in the books. And the weird reason, it was a weird choice to make, because the Huntington collection is actually, Huntington didn't really like books that were heavily marked. But one of the things that study revealed was that one of the things that the study brought out was a shift in the way that we value books from the robber barons who wanted books that were pristine, and now we want books that are heavily marked. And this book seems like a kind of an antidote to that line of research, where the thoughts of the reader are valued over the association with the book. So that, for example, we have in the Rutgers library a copy of William Wordsworth's Paradise Lost, and that was, that has he gave it to his friend Thomas Powell, and sort of sign in the front that, from Wordsworth to Thomas Powell. But the regret that we always express, at least in the, after reading all this stuff by people like Bill Sherman, is that there are no comments, no marks in the book, that Wordsworth made about giving us some insight about, Wordsworth's thinking about Milton. And so I'm just thinking, what is your, are there moments in your study where you find Charles Lamb, actually reflecting, or how do you value those moments where the association and the thinking that comes along with reading a book come together?
Mm-hmm. So to be honest, Coleridge is the most interesting, annotator that there ever was. I mean, he invented the term marginalia. He's got, if you look at the volumes, the Princeton University shelf of marginalia collected, it's like this. But everybody had a different practice of annotation. So Lamb tended to do clerkly things, like he read and reread incessantly. But when he actually wrote in his books, he made corrections. He was obsessive about correcting the text, cross-references, biographies of authors, and see this or see that. So that was the kind of annotator he was. And if a poem from, say, some other source came to mind as belonging in that book, he would copy it in there. So he copied in, I don't know how many lines of Skelton's Richard Sparrow, but it was like 1,200 lines. He squeezed it into the margins because every other bird but the sparrow was mentioned. So, or the owl. Anyway, he tended not to put thought into his notes. Wordsworth signed his name on the title pages, shelved the books. He's a horrible letter writer. He didn't put any of his heart into his letters. Zero businessman in his letters. Whereas Keats, his annotations on Paradise Lost are still with us today. This is, it's sublime pathos and so forth. Sublime pathetic. He wrote all over that, largely to guide Fanny Braun's reading of the poem, but also because he recorded what struck him. And so it really is all about the personality behind the handwriting, what kind of things they do. You know, Coleridge looked, for example, for, if you compare two books, one is the history and one is, say, philosophy of mind or something. That's what interested Coleridge. He had thought history was just accidental, wasn't worth. So he has hardly any notes at all. Whereas Lamb will say, oh, I loved this page, see that page, when he gave the book to Coleridge. Whereas something like John Petwin's Letters Concerning Mind is just full of Coleridge's reflections. John Donne's poetry is full of it. So again, like the personality of the reader really comes through. And Lamb spoke really knowing. Lamb said that Coleridge's marginalia competed with the text, not just in terms of quality, often in terms of quantities. And, you know, he said, you know, Coleridge will write all of your books and maybe he'll lose them, but when you get them back, they're enriched. But, you know, you have to be a really special mind to be able to do that across an array of different books.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you, Denise.